Hello and welcome back to the PSD to HTML responsive portfolio build. In this lesson, we're going to finish up some of our responsive media queries here by changing the way our footer behaves whenever we resize. So once we get to that same breakpoint here where we're reaching 640 pixels and things are changing their arrangement, we're also going to change the footer so that we no longer have three columns. Instead, they're just going to be stacked on top of each other, and that's pretty simple to do. So I'm going to jump into our CSS, and I've moved everything into the Site24 folder now. And then down here below everything else, but still inside that media query, notice we're still inside the closing curly bracket for that media query, we're going to point to our columns. And remember, our columns for our footer have a class of col-1-third. And what we're going to do is simply set our float to none so that they'll no longer be floating to the left. And then we'll set our width for those columns to 100%. Save that. Go back to our page and refresh it. And now our items are all stacked on top of each other instead of lined up in three columns. And just to double check, we'll go all the way to the bottom, make sure our copyright still looks fine, and it does. And we are now almost done with our responsive design. The last thing we need to do is we need to tackle our menu item here. And what we need to do is actually use a little bit of jQuery. Don't let that frighten you if you've never used JavaScript or jQuery before. It's just a couple of lines of code that we're going to use to get that menu to work. So once it disappears, we want to click on that to see our menu drop down so that we can click to go to another page. So we're going to add that jQuery to our index.html file, but first we need to actually link to jQuery, otherwise we won't be able to use it. So we're going to go back up to the head of our document, and then down here just below our style sheet, we're going to link to jQuery, and we're going to do that by going to, let's go ahead and expand our browser out a little bit for now, code.jquery.com, and we want to link using the jQuery CDN. So we can scroll down and see different versions of jQuery that we can use, but you'll notice that with 2.x, i.e. anything less than IE9 is not supported yet, so we're going to jump down to this one here. And we can click on the minified version to view it, or we can just right click on the minified version and click on copy link address. Then we're going to use that link address in our HTML. So just below or just before our closing head tag, I'm going to create a script tag, and we're going to set the source for that equal to that link we just copied. So code.jquery.com/jquery-1.11.0.min.js. There might be a more recent version by the time you watch this video series, or there might not be. And then we'll put our closing script tag after it. Then all the code that I'm going to use for our menu, I'm going to put down here just before the closing body tag. So we'll put a few line breaks in there. And then somewhere between the closing footer tag and the closing body tag, we're going to put a script tag. And we'll go ahead and put our closing script tag. So when you're using jQuery, the first thing we want to do is we want to wait till the entire page is finished loading before we run our code. And the way we do that, I'm not going to go into detail on how this works, but we're going to type $, a set of parentheses, and inside that parentheses, we're going to create a function. So we'll type function, another set of opening and closing parentheses, an opening curly bracket, then we'll skip a couple lines, put our closing curly bracket, and then a semicolon at the end of that. So we have this function that is called after the entire page is finished loading. So inside that function, we want to point to our navigation list. Remember, it has a class of nav-list, and we can actually use that CSS selector in jQuery to point to it. But we don't want to point to it. The way you would point to it, first of all, is you would type $, and then inside parentheses and inside single quotes, we would type nav or .nav-list. So we can point to that particular item, that navigation list in jQuery using that CSS selector of .nav-list. However, referring to it this way can be a little taxing on the system. So what I'm going to do is, to avoid referring to it this way over and over again, is I'm going to create a variable called $nav, and then we'll just set it equal to this value. So anytime we want to refer to that nav list, we can now refer to it using this $nav variable. So what I want to do is, when I click on that menu icon that we created, and that menu icon, if you remember, has a class of menu-icon, whenever we click on that, I want our navigation to open up. So we'll skip a couple lines, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to point to that menu icon first of all. So we're going to say .menu-icon, and again, that's contained inside quotation marks, inside parentheses, just after that $, no space after the $, or it's not going to work. And then in order to create a click event, just after that closing parenthesis, we're going to type .click, and then in parentheses, we're going to type function, open and close parentheses again, open curly bracket, skip a couple lines, and then a close curly bracket, and then we'll put a semicolon after that closed curly bracket. Then inside this function, this click function, we're going to type the code that we want to occur whenever we click on that menu icon. Well, when I click on that menu icon, I want this navigation to toggle open and closed, basically. And there's a great function in jQuery for that called slide toggle. So we're going to point to that nav list class, which is that drop-down nav menu that we have now. And again, we can refer to it now using $nav. And we're going to say $nav dot slide toggle with a capital T. And since it's a function, we need to include open and close parentheses and a semicolon to end that statement. So let's see if that works. Save it, jump back into our page and refresh it, and then we'll resize it until we can see our menu icon there. And now when we click on it, it expands open, and we can click on it again to collapse it. The problem now is if I resize my browser up, that menu icon disappears, but my menu doesn't come back. So we're going to create some more jQuery to make that happen. So we're still inside this document ready function, this function that isn't going to run until everything has loaded. Just inside that, we're going to skip a couple lines and make sure you pay attention to the placement of all these closing curly brackets and parentheses and everything, because things might break if you don't. So if you're having some problems getting your code to work right, then double check to make sure that all your parentheses and curly brackets are in the right place. So after the closing curly bracket and parenthesis for this click function, but before the closing curly bracket for this document ready function, we're going to create another function. What we're going to do is we're going to create a function that detects when we're resizing the window. And if the window's width is greater than 640 or greater than or equal to 640 pixels, then we want that navigation to show up. We want this nav list menu to show up. We want to set its display to visible or block or whatever it is. Well, there's a function in jQuery called show and another one called hide that allows us to do that. So the way this is going to happen is this time we have $sign in parentheses, but instead of a CSS selector, we're just going to type window, which will point to the current browser window. And then after the parentheses, we're going to type dot resize, and then inside parentheses, something that we've done already a couple of times, function, open and close parentheses, open and close curly brackets, and then a semicolon after that closing parenthesis at the end. So inside this function, we're going to basically test to see if the width of the window is greater than or equal to 640. And if it is, then we want to see our menu. We want it to show up in that gray nav bar, that light gray nav bar at the top. So the way we do that is we type if, and when we're using an if statement, we'll then type parentheses and put our condition inside those parentheses. And then if it ends up being true, we'll put everything we want to happen inside these curly brackets here. So our conditional here is we're testing to see what the size of the window is as we're resizing it. That's what this resize function does. All of this code inside this resize function is going to run over and over again as long as we're resizing it. So we're going to test to see if the width of the window, so we'll point to window.width, and width is a function there. It's not a property, it's a function. So we have parentheses there as well. We're going to see if that's equal to, actually we're going to see if it's greater than or equal to 640. So let me put a little space in here so you can see this a little bit better. So we're pointing to the window again here, and we're checking the width of the window. If the width of that window is greater than or equal to 640, then what do we want to happen? We want that navigation menu to show up. So we're going to say $nav.show, and that show method is a jQuery method. Then we can say else. In other words, if our window's width is less than 640, we want to hide it. So $nav dot hide, open and close parentheses, semicolon to end your statement. And that's all the jQuery you need. Now, if you can't get this to work right, you might go back and watch this video a couple of times to try to understand it if you've never used jQuery before. And if you still can't get it to work right, it might behoove you just to come into the project files and copy this script and paste it into your own file. But let's save that and see if it works. We'll jump back into our code, refresh the page, and we can see our menu at first, but that wasn't a problem before. It wasn't a problem until we shrunk it down and then resized it back up. So let's make it smaller again. Let's expand it out and contract it, and then let's make it larger again, and hopefully the menu text will show up again, and it does. We go smaller, and it still works. And now we are finally done with our responsive portfolio site. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.